Good to see you all. There we go. We've got a great group here. My name is Mason Ailstock. I'm the president of the Rowen Foundation. And to everybody, I love that I see so many familiar faces here, and that's always amazing anytime you travel across the metro or Georgia and get to see friends and colleagues that you may not connect with, at least in person, as often as we would hope, perhaps over Zoom. But great to see everyone, and thank you again for joining us. Today we've got a really important conversation, not just to Rowen, but to Georgia Tech and to our community, to the state, around the workforce of the future. And what does that mean as we think about society, as we think about empowering and equipping the leaders of today and of tomorrow, and how to work closely with industry in ensuring that that workforce has all of the resources and to not just plug in, but to really evolve. And what does that look like? Before we jump in, I do want to take a moment to recognize the amazing members of our board of directors, the Rowen Foundation Board of Directors. Sachin Salendra, president of SG Contracting, serves as our board chair. Dr. Deborah Bruner, senior vice president of research at Emory University, University of Georgia Provost Jack Hugh, Arthur Tripp, former congressional advisor, and Dr. Jan Joseph, the president of Georgia Gwinnett College, Sam Hinton, serving on our board, and then finally Mr. Bert Reeves, Vice President of Institute Relations at Georgia Tech, and also our host today. And Bert, a special thank you to you and your team in making today possible, working in partnership both on the programming side but also in serving on the board. And I want to take a moment to recognize the Rowen staff and our many advisors and consultants and supporters that really have spent the last 2 years since Rowen was first announced as this transformational, multi-generational, multi-institutional project that has a vision over the next 50 years to create something very special and unique for Georgia that has positive impact across our country and around the world. And our staff, our partners, really make all of that possible on a daily basis in moving Rowen forward and bringing it to life. So we do have a great conversation that Bert is going to host with industry leaders, and great to have a group of folks that are here that are students that are from the community to be a part of the discussion. Encourage everyone that as we have the conversation to think about questions in your particular field. If you're a student, what are you thinking about in the workforce, and how do you see yourself engaging there? To interact with the panel. So before we jump into the panel, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Steve McLaughlin, Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Georgia Tech, to offer a few remarks. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that intro, and most of all, thank you all for coming to Georgia Tech today. I'll share a couple of things, but I think a huge thanks goes to Rowen for bringing everyone to Georgia Tech to talk about workforce development, because we feel like we have something to say in that space. And I think maybe, for that topic, maybe chose one of the better spots to do that. You are in the John Lewis Student Center. We just reopened this just a couple weeks ago. This is the first time I've been in this building, and it's just fantastic to see everyone here. Just a little bit about that. John Lewis was our congressman for several decades. He was not a Georgia Tech alum, but you maybe know that he was a student at the time where he probably became most famous several decades ago, and he's really an inspiration to our student leaders, and I think we're kind of leveraging that to bring a renewed focus on student leadership, and so that's why we named this after John Lewis. A little bit about Georgia Tech. Even some of our own folks don't know that we are the #1 source of technical talent in America. We are 46,000 students now. Over 80% of those students are studying engineering or computer science, and that really does make us the single greatest source of technical talent. We take all of that really seriously. We also recognize that's maybe why a lot of technology companies are really flooding to Midtown, flooding to the west side. You know about what Microsoft is doing. Google just built, a 30-story tower, and as our president always says, the logos of all these companies are very strategically facing our campus, so that our students know that they're here. A ton of brag points. about Georgia Tech these days. We are now the #1 university in America in terms of research support of a university that doesn't have a medical school. And so the kinds of research that we do here now places us at the very top. You might be thinking, oh, there's a 3-letter university somewhere in the Northeast. You can't possibly have beat them. We finally have surpassed them. So we're very, very proud of that. I'm a kind of a person who, one of the sayings in our family is tend to the obvious. This week, the U.S. News and World U.S. News and World Report rankings came out for undergraduate programs, and the news was almost entirely good for us. All of our engineering programs are ranked in the top 4. Again, can't say that about several universities on the West Coast and another university in the East Coast. Many of our programs among public institutions are ranked #1, even if they're ranked 2 overall. So we have not only size, but we also think quality. A couple of other really big things that have happened in the last 2 weeks. We received the largest research grant in our history, focused on from the Build Back Better program, the federal government response around AI and manufacturing, $65 million award. Maybe you'll have a chance to learn a little bit more about that, but that space kind of between artificial intelligence and manufacturing is a place where, again, in terms of talent, in terms of workforce development, we'd like to think we are the place for that. I think I'll kind of pause there. Again, I don't want to brag. Of course, I do want to brag more and more, but I think times, dare I say, the pandemic has been a time where places like Georgia Tech really shone. And it was obviously a very difficult time for many of us, but I think the renewed interest in STEM talent, tech talent, commercialization, entrepreneurship, the kinds of things that take place on our campus, I think will really contribute to your conversation today is what we do. So again, I want to thank Rowen for being here, talking about workforce development. If it's possible, I'd like to introduce my colleague and good friend, Bert Reeves. As you heard, our Vice President for Institute Relations, and I know he's going to lead us today. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Steve and Mason and panelists. Y'all have a seat here. I'm Bert Reeves. I'm one of our vice presidents here at Georgia Tech, and it is a real honor for me to be able to take part in the Rowen Foundation, and it is truly, we're at the beginning stages of a 50-year plan that's going to be transformative, and it's wonderful what has been assembled, and it's a real honor for me to get to have a seat at that table and help to grow this vision into the most that it can be. But what I want to do, we're going to have a great discussion here today, and we've got some questions. If it, along the way, if any of you have questions, just throw your hand up, and we want to make this interactive. But why don't we take a couple minutes and just have everybody on the panel introduce themselves and talk about where they are and what kind of things we want to talk about today. I will say we'll start with Chris. Chris and I were classmates at Georgia Tech. We were actually fraternity brothers back in the late 90s here, so we've agreed not to tell any stories. So.
Thanks, Bert. And Bert probably has more stories about me than I have about Bert. So my name is Chris Shaver. I lead Global Product Management Organization at Dematic. Dematic is a provider of warehouse automation solutions. So hardware, software, mechatronics, anything that helps get that Amazon package from Amazon to your front door, and everything in between. So really excited to be here. Our global headquarters is actually here on campus at Georgia Tech. We're over in the CODA building just across the street in Tech Square. So really excited to be here, spend some time with the group, and share the stage with Bert and these other panelists.
Thank you. Got it?
Yeah.
Great to meet everybody today. I'm interested in more stories, but maybe that's after the panel. Yes, my name is Suna Lumeh, and I serve as the Director of Operations for Portal Innovations, which is a life science venture engine, and we support local startups that want to scale locally. Our perspective on Atlanta and why we expanded to this ecosystem is because we do believe that some of our coastal partners, which will not be named, are stealing our stories, especially in the biological and biomedical life sciences. And we want to make sure that Atlanta is growing and supporting the best founders, startups that are coming from institutions like Georgia Tech and staying here and scaling to produce and contribute to the local economy. Yeah, so I'm happy to talk more about how we're going to do that and with our partners.
Great. Thank you. Doug.
Yeah, thank you, Bert. So I'm Doug Britton, and I lead the Agricultural Technology Research Program here at Georgia Tech. And our vision is really to transform the poultry, agribusiness, and food manufacturing sectors in the state through advanced technologies. And so we work very closely with our friends up in Athens and at other land-grant institutions. But we layer on top of that a technology component, which we think is going to be critical moving forward, particularly as we look at workforce, as we look at efficiencies gained in terms of industry operations. So, yeah, thanks. Pleasure to be here.
Great. All right, well, we'll just get things kicked off. The first question, and we'll start with you, Chris, but talk about what innovation has had the greatest impact on your industry, and how has it changed your thinking about the future of your field?
You know, so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about supply chain. Would ask the other panelists can chime in with their color commentary. You know, you look at what's happened in the last couple of years that all of us have been impacted by. So many disruptions. COVID is the obvious big one, but you think about port closures and part shortages and you know, conflict and strife in Europe, raw material prices just escalating, skyrocketing, labor challenges, right? All of those are disruptions. In many cases were unplanned disruptions. And so how do we think about, from a supply chain perspective, being able to adjust to those disruptions? We talked you know, a little bit earlier about artificial intelligence, machine learning capabilities. That is going to be groundbreaking as we look at supply chain in the future. How do we take all those disruptions, all those complexities, and make supply chain simple for our customers so that you all can still go to the grocery store and have choices on the shelves, right? You know, you think about artificial intelligence. We have a partner. This is wild to think about. They predicted, everybody remember the toilet paper shortage in early 2020, right? I know we all were there. We all, you know, ran to the store to go find toilet paper. One of our partners predicted the toilet paper shortage 3 to 4 months before it happened. As an organization, if you have that information, how do you adjust your supply chain to account for the fact that there's going to be a massive shortage 3 to 4 months down the road? Those are the kinds of things, that's the type of breakthrough when you think about artificial intelligence that's going to remove the complexity out of the supply chain and make it more simplistic.
That's great. And Chris, since you brought up Amazon packages and logistics earlier, if there's any way you can slow down the packages from coming that my wife orders every day that show up, if you could slow down the ones coming to my house, that would be wonderful.
I'm trying to solve the same problem in my house, right? If I look at the credit card bills. So.
I think we're seeing a niche industry. Somebody solve this problem. Suma, what are your thoughts to the first question?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna kind of piggyback on Chris, but of course my perspective is always gonna go back to human health. And clearly in the past 2 years, you see the importance of not one size fits all. So I think one of the biggest benefits to our society right now and where we are technologically is that we have done the human genome. I think that got completed earlier this year. But just thinking about genomics research and then thinking about the applications in human health where not one drug that comes out to market isn't going to fit that target population the same way. So being able to take in according the precision medicine and that understanding how one person living in Nevada or living in DC or living in New Mexico, like how that's going to impact based on social determinants of health, based on their own genetic sequencing, based on that's all predictable. So just like we can predict paper toilet shortages, one day we should be able to predict within every single human being how a response to a drug or even how exposure in a certain elements based on where they live, how they grow up, their demographics, their social constraints, how that impacts their ability to fight or to fend off disease.
So I'm going to piggyback on that, Bert, if that's okay. If you look at the agricultural and food sector, probably the largest or most impactful innovation, and we could argue at Tech whether this is a technology or not, has been in the area of genetics and understanding genetics in diversity of agricultural sectors, but also looking at nutrition when you start thinking about animal agriculture and the ability to tune nutrition specifically to the needs of an animal or to understand the genetics for breeding programs that give you the productivity and efficiencies that you need. These have had significant impacts in terms of the industry. Now here's the caveat. We've started to really plateau, I think, a good bit in terms of our gains in that front. So when we start looking at efficiencies and you look at, feed conversion, which is the amount of feed that goes into an animal that produces meat, or if you look at yields coming off of crop cycles, we've really not seen huge gains probably in the last 10 years. We've seen incremental gains or sustaining gains. And so the next level or wave of innovation that I think is going to have a significant impact is on the hard technology side. So looking at automation that helps us to be more intelligent with how we process that agricultural input, or looking at technology that allows us to more effectively and efficiently water and fertilize and feed these particular agricultural commodities is going to have a huge impact. And then also the labor, we're going to be talking about that, but the labor impacts, we're already seeing automation. I think COVID put a little bit of a fuel on that fire, but we're seeing automation really become a big conversation in the agricultural space.
Thank you, Doug. Suma, when you were talking about the health sciences in the future, it reminded me a couple weeks ago, we have a program at Georgia Tech called CreateX. It's one of the neatest things that we do on our entire campus. We have student entrepreneurs, students, some of whom are freshmen, that we have an environment, CreateX, a class they take, and they basically get to start their company. And then once they go through business plans and all of that type of stuff, there's an expo that happens, which was a couple weeks ago. And I went to this expo. This expo is full of venture capitalists. Literally deals are made in the room of wanting to finance these student companies. There was a young lady that has, through CreateX, developed an app. And she was inspired because diabetes has impacted her family. She developed an app that allows a person to use to create a personal profile specific to your body, your diabetic condition, and then that program partners with the app called Instacart. I think it's the grocery shopping, and it will give you, if you can pick any product on Instacart, and it will grade from 0 to 10 whether, how good or bad that product is for you, with this is a 2.3 and it explains why, or this is an 8.9. Unbelievable. And I think it's just, that's where the future is heading, y'all. It's pretty amazing. But moving on to the next question, maybe unpack a little bit from our first question, but what are the large, complex, and global, so big, large, complex, and global issues that your fields are attempting to solve? Suma, why don't we start with you?
I think you just gave an excellent example of that. I think when it comes to, everybody's familiar with big pharma and the healthcare industry and all the work that we have to do to get that up to par, to be able to treat humans and to serve humans. You talked about diabetes, and chronic health effect is the most financially and also, the biggest healthcare target in the health system backing up their systems. Although I think one of the biggest problems is that we haven't broken down who and why they suffer. And I think apps like that are addressing those problems. And so I think when we work backwards to, if we're really trying to make sure that everybody lives their fullest potential physically and health-wise, I think we also, again, it goes back to how's this individual living their life day to day? What decisions are they making? And I think when we, as investors, and looking at different drugs and looking at different medical devices, different applications like you just mentioned, the question is, how is this going to reach the target demographic? And that's the biggest question. And in terms of workforce, those solutions and those answers are going to come from those people who experience this on the day to day. And so our challenge is to keep them, and we'll talk about it, I'm sure, interested in the sciences, keep them interested in the impact that they could have, so that you can go to a CreateX and you can develop and showcase this app, and it can get visibility, so you can start impacting those target communities that actually suffer from this day to day. So I think from the healthcare perspective, it's, are we keeping the right talent to fend off diseases that are continuously prevalent in these underrepresented or overrepresented populations?
Thank you, Suna. Doug, what are your thoughts on this, especially in the context of, we talk about large, complex, and global issues with agriculture. Obviously, the world's fertilizer production line has been affected by the situation in Ukraine right now. Kind of talk us through where your perspective is on those issues, and what are we doing to solve them?
Well, it's interesting, Bert. I just got back from a conference, a national conference for food manufacturers and distributors, and one of the primary topics of conversation was this rail issue that may be coming forward. We don't realize how much of our raw agricultural commodity product travels by rail to the processing facility, and if those shut down, we're going to feel it across the country in terms of what's available in our grocery stores. And so that's a huge thing in terms of logistics. Also on the fertilizer front, matter of fact, Bert, I'm so excited. We just were part of a project that's looking at alternative methods for generating fertilizer here at Georgia Tech, a large National Science Foundation program. But yeah, the conversation at that conference was really around how we're playing whack-a-mole, right? First it was COVID. Then it was things like avian influenza and disease, hitting our flocks and our animal agriculture. Then it's a shortage of fertilizers, and how do we recover from that? And now we're looking at transportation and logistics, and how do we accommodate that? And I think once we've gotten into this real globally interlinked industry and sectors, and historically you have to understand agriculture was always considered somewhat of a rural, kind of localized industry, and it is no longer that way. It is a global, complex industry. We're starting to see implications of ripple effects from Ukraine or from other parts of the world. In particular, it's interesting, there's also this issue with African swine flu, right, that's hit a lot of Asia, and Asia consumes a lot of pork. And as a result, that's driven up prices of poultry because there was availability where there wasn't availability of meat. So there's these dynamics in the marketplace which are dictating a lot. And when you talk about being a farmer in today's environment on the economic scale, you're not only having to deal with weather and soil conditions, but you're having to deal with global economic shifts and changes in terms of availability and dynamics in the space. So it is a real complex system, and I think there's going to be real opportunity in the future for driving some intelligence into that space. So as Chris, you were mentioning, being able to do some predictive analysis would be a huge benefit to our agricultural communities.
Great. Chris, did you have anything to add to that?
Maybe just one from a supply chain perspective. When you think about these big global challenges and hurdles that we're trying to solve for, in one word, sustainability. For those of us who are I think most folks here are from Atlanta, if you spend any time on 285, you're surrounded by an army of tractor trailers, and you think about the carbon offset from the tractor trailers, but just the end-to-end supply chain. How do we solve for that? How do we take waste out of the supply chain? We've talked a lot about artificial intelligence. One of our goals, when we think about artificial intelligence, how do we optimize the supply chain, as an example, to take 10% of the tractor trailers off the road today, right? 10%, that's a huge impact. You see a lot of grocers who have come out, and by 2025 or 2030, they want to have zero food waste. What impact does that have on the supply chain in terms of inventory planning, inventory placement, making sure that you've got the inventory at the right place at the right time, so we as consumers can go in and make sure we're getting fresh goods as opposed to goods that are about to be hitting an expiration date. So sustainability is a major focus in the supply chain space.
Thank you, Chris. That's great insight. As I mentioned earlier, Rowen's a 50-year vision. It's all about the future. And it's funny, I graduated from Georgia Tech in 2000. So that was 22 years ago. And I probably have a small mind when it comes to some of this stuff, but I could say I had no way of envisioning what the world was going to look like and where we are today. In 2000, walked the stage, got my diploma. I didn't know what the future, and that's just 22 years. We're looking down the road 50 plus years. And so I think the importance of this can't be understated. how do we prepare students for the future when we don't even know what the future looks like? We don't know what the roles that people are going to play. They're not even known to us right now. How do we think that far out? Chris, can you start us off with this one?
It's a tough question to solve for when you're thinking, 50 years out. We don't know what we don't know, but I think what we can do now is to ensure that our students are trained in interdisciplinary modes, right? So you think about, in the world today, as an example, I am not the workforce of the future, right? And the reason I say that is we want to be able to see somebody who has a really strong technological background, right? That engineering background, that science background, the mathematics background, but somebody who also understands the business side of things too, right? And bringing those two together is going to be critical, that you've got almost that bipolar mind that can solve some of these challenges, right? So that's the first part. The second piece is being able to span across different industries, right? As we set up here today, we support 3 different industries, but you start to see a common thread through all those industries. And so how does something that Doug is working on in the agricultural space impact supply chain versus biomed and biotech? There's a common thread there, so finding those resources who have the ability, the flexibility, the agility to balance between industries is going to be critical in the future.
Super.
Yeah, great point. I would start this answer off with saying I think they are preparing us as leaders because it's our job to really pay attention to how they're learning, how they're developing, and we had this conversation a little bit ago, but it's how I learned is not how this generation is learning. They are able to take in and retain so much, and I think it's our jobs to recognize that and to adapt and be able to give them more, because I think they are living in a world that is requiring more of them, more beyond, I think, my capacity and how I'm used to learning and receiving. And so I think one of our biggest challenges as leaders is to, again, start keeping tabs of that and understanding that the interdisciplinariness, new word, the ability to cross over multiple different industries and sectors, for example, because I love that. The COVID tracker index, which Emory produced, was actually the brainchild, I found this out a couple months ago, of a civil engineer. So it's things like that, it's the crossover. I want to say it was a Georgia Tech alum who helped do that, but we'll see. But yeah, it's just things like that those ideas formulate in a very active, a very dynamic, and a very different type of person in which I think right now industry and society is used to seeing, and I think it's up to us to be able to adapt and recognize it and provide the resources and information so that they can develop further to solve the problems.
Oh, that's great. I think historically our academic programs have really focused on information transfer, right? Really understanding and information transfer. And I think more moving in the future, I think what we're really going to be looking for are people who are curious, right? Trying to and willing to understand. We say very much in our program, because we're all engineers in our ag tech program, right? We're not animal scientists or plant scientists. And we really feel that the innovation in the future is going to happen at the intersection of disciplines, right? So where you have multiple disciplines coming together to really tackle a problem. And it may be that you don't necessarily have to have the expertise in the other discipline, but you certainly have to have an appreciation and a curiosity about it to understand that there is contribution that can be made in some of those other sectors. And so having that opportunity, and I think it goes back to creating opportunities and experiences for the future generation to gain an appreciation for what other disciplines can contribute and how they can partner with those other disciplines in order to create something new and something interesting or something better.
Great. And thank y'all all for your comments on that. And, talking about the future, I'm sitting here thinking about a documentary that I watched on, if any of you fly Delta, I highly recommend next time you fly, watch. It's available on the Entertainment Center. It's called The Father of the Cyborgs. It's a documentary about a Georgia, Atlanta-based physician that's with Emory, whose life work is, I'm just going to summarize this. Folks that are quadriplegic, that are trapped inside, is the terminology they use. They can't communicate. He has taken the electricity that happens in your brain and goes in and has performed surgeries where he connects things, electrodes or whatever, I'm not going to use the right word there, to brains, and is allowing folks that are quadriplegic to look at a screen and with their mind move a cursor and spell words and communicate for the first time since they're out. It's absolutely fascinating. I remember when I was at Tech, we had one of my roommates, a guy named Dustin Johnson, who was way smarter than I was, and he used to tell me back then, someday we're going to be able to communicate telepathically to each other. And I'm like, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard about. Well, it turns out that back in the 90s, they were working on all this, and it was a real thing, and he knew what he was talking about. I thought it was crazy. It's far-fetched, and that'll never happen. But that really kind of transitions us to my next question about youth. I think that the youth, the young minds of today, can grasp that that is where we're going. And in our lifetimes, we will probably see this technology happen. It's exciting. It's also terrifying, right? But so I want to ask y'all, looking at Rowen and understanding the mission of Rowen and how youth engagement at Rowen is going to be critical as the foundation, as we build today and support the next generation of leaders. From your perspectives, how can Rowen create meaningful opportunities for our youth who understand these great visions and have visions to complement them? How can Rowen create opportunities for these youth to engage your organizations, your industries, and your field? Doug, why don't you start us off?
I'm going to kick that one off. So again, experiences, right? I think there are opportunities for students to gain experiences outside of their traditional disciplines. So when you think, so we have anywhere between 20 and 40 students that work in our program at any given time in the year. Those students are all engineering or physics or biology students. They're not agricultural sciences, or they're not ag engineering students. And yet they're getting an opportunity to see and understand how technology can apply to a discipline outside of what their traditional mindset might be. Expanding that understanding, giving them those opportunities. Tech has a great co-op program, which I think gives our students an opportunity to experience real-world workforce and go out and test their ideas. But the other part of it is we also, as leaders in industry and in academia, need to be careful not to kill the plant in the greenhouse. Okay, that's a very agricultural expression. But what I mean by that is a lot of times young people, to Suna's point, come in with ideas and interesting ideas, and they'll ask questions that maybe haven't been asked before. But if we create a culture where that's really kind of frowned upon, where the young person or the new person is not expected or not even welcome to ask a question or to pose an idea, we'll miss out on significant learning and understanding, both for them and for us. And so we have found it super important that we empower our students that work in our program to be full research engineers on our activities and to ask the questions that maybe they don't understand, because we often understand new things when we have to answer them, or when we have to go, we don't know, and let's find out. So I think really it's creating experiences. I'll tell you, Bert, some of the things that are going on, when we look at the national landscape for research, they're requiring all these national programs, whether it's the National Science Foundation or the NIH or the USDA, they're requiring student experiences as part of those programs. And I think it's intentional. They're trying to find a way to get us out of our somewhat comfort zones and into environments where we have to encounter diversity, both of thought, but also of perspective, also of experience. And so I think that's become a key part of what's going on, and where I think there's going to be opportunity and a need in the future.
Chris, what do you have to add?
I couldn't agree more in terms of getting folks out of their comfort zone. You think about us as consumers, and then you think about college students and even our children. They don't know what they don't know, right? They haven't seen. They don't understand what it means to first grow that tomato on a vine, right? What goes into growing that tomato, how that tomato then moves from the farm to the grocery store. The only thing they understand is that when I go to the grocery store, I get to get a piece of candy at the checkout counter, right? That is their vision as a consumer, but it's the entire back end that they don't understand. So how do we give people like that, and not just young kids, right? I've got a 7 and a 9-year-old, but even at the college graduate level, those unique real world experiences, I think that's where there's some unique partnerships that can continue to grow and help the youth.
Thank you, Chris. So we've covered, broad industries where the three of you come from. We've talked a little bit about the future and engaging young minds. Let's really pivot to the workforce of the future now. What inequities do each of you see in the workforce currently? How have they impacted your company or changed your approach, not just with hiring, but also with retention? What lessons have we learned that relate to this through the pandemic? Talk about what we've learned and how we are overcoming these inequities. Suma, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, well, I can speak for just the venture ops, lab ops type of perspective, which is quick thinkers, people who have encountered incredible problems in the past and have retained some learnings and lessons. It's this entrepreneurial mind of problem solving. I think that is essential in any job, but specifically in the STEM fields. And then as you start getting into these leadership positions and more of these STEM discipline roles, you want people quick on their feet who have this breadth of information that they can pull from. So I think in order to get there, again, working backwards, it would be who were these people and how did they develop? And what did they have access to that allowed them to actually have experiences that allow them to foresee, I can solve this problem this way, this way, this way, or this way. How do I do that? And what's going to be the best, and have them self-analyze what's going to be the best path for the determined goal.
Great. Doug, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is a really tough question, Bert. If we look at Metro Atlanta, we have so many opportunities for our students, right? There's so many opportunities for them to do internships and other activities, and our schools are generally well positioned, although there's still some inequities in the school systems. But if we look at our rural communities, they don't have a lot of those opportunities. And so programs like our Directed Discovery program or other opportunities where we can export some of the experiences of technology and the delivery of that technology, whether it's over a Zoom, right? You talked about how everybody's now familiar with Zoom or WebEx. How do we get that information? How do we allow them to see an experiment happening at Georgia Tech in South Georgia, right? Where the students are in a classroom with a faculty member or a teacher there that's guiding their thinking, but then watching that experiment happen in one of the Georgia Tech labs. Right? So how do we help them gain an understanding, gain experience without having to be physically present, right? And how do we deliver that in a meaningful way? And it takes a lot of intentional thinking about what is impactful. Again, I think it also takes some listening to students. There are students that I think are really interested in technology careers that may not have the opportunity to be part of a robotics club or to have a faculty member that encourages them to go into that direction. And so how do we find ways to provide those experiences and opportunities to communities that don't have the resources maybe that we have in the metro area?
Thank you, Doug. Chris, what are your thoughts?
I'll hit two real quick if I'm allowed to take two. So the first one is related to data analytics. And so you both mentioned data. There's so much data and information in the world today that people have access to. The challenge is, how do we leverage and harness that data to drive decision making, right? And that's where there's a bit of a gap. I serve on the advisory board for Georgia Tech's Supply Chain and Logistics Institute, and we just had one of our biannual meetings last week, and they shared some information. So within the industrial engineering school, they have a few different principles, areas of focus. There's a new area of focus that they've just launched in the last couple of years around data analytics. Just in the last couple of years, right, they've just launched it. It is now the single highest enrollment in terms of areas of focus within the industrial engineering school, just in a couple of years, right? And so that is driven by those of us, out in the real world, because we see that gap. We see that inequity in terms of leveraging data science to help make decision making. So that's the first one. The second one, unrelated to those, is you look at, what we're talking about today is largely technology-based careers and industries that we're in. My company is a supply chain company. My company is also an engineering company. And if you think about supply chain, it's largely a male-dominated industry. You think about engineering, it's largely a male-dominated industry. If you look at what Georgia Tech has done, so the incoming class this year, the freshman class, 46% female. That is a staggering improvement over where it's been. Bert, I think when you and I were in school, that number was around 30%. So I love that there's a focus on females in technology roles in the technology world. I would prefer to see that number at 50%, and I have I have all the confidence in the world that Georgia Tech will get that to 50-50, right? So that's a big one, is those two inequities around data analytics and then making sure that we continue to drive females in these technology and engineering workforces. So.
Great. So as we talk about the workforce of the future, the word I'm going to use in the question is credentials, not degrees, because we're talking about something that's beyond degrees. Credentials includes all aspects of technical school skill sets, certifications, all this type of things. What are the credentials that will be in highest demand for the workforce in your particular industries? From your perspective, how accessible are those credentials? So maybe we go back to some inequities here. How accessible are those credentials, and what do we do to overcome that? Doug, why don't you start?
Yeah, sure. The skill sets are shifting significantly when we look at traditional agricultural operations, right? As we look at more automation, and I think that's going to be what allows us to continue the gains in efficiency that we've accomplished over the last, I'll say, 100 years, really, in agriculture. The skill sets are shifting, right? It's becoming more of a technology-focused skill set. It doesn't mean that they have to have a degree in computer science. But what it does mean is they have to have an understanding, and quite frankly, the new generation is they're digital natives, right? I might be the last of the group up here that's not, but and so they have an understanding and they have an appreciation for what technology can bring. We've got to make sure that we leverage that as we move into the technology of the future, right? As we're looking at driving information, and if we look at skill sets, there's still some fundamental understanding. But I'll go back to that curiosity. I'll go back to that. Understanding of fundamentals in math and science, but I'm not convinced that the labor force of the future all needs a college degree either. I think there are significant opportunities in the trades, and I'm happy to see there's a bit of a resurgence, I think, in the trades occurring, but I think those trades also need to be technology intensive, right? We've got to teach people how to apply the technologies to the problems that they're addressing, that they're looking at.
Suma, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree completely. I think there is going to be this heavy demand for computational skills and the application to everything you can do. I think where the biggest challenge of the future is making sure that it is inclusive and accessible. So that does mean taking a look at some of our biggest problems, understanding, for health sciences again, human health, the patient populations, who is not in the room helping to analyze this so that it's culturally appropriate. It is taking into account things that typically the standard male-dominated room that lacks ethnical diversity, that lacks cultural diversity, that lacks these insights that are critical. Again, when we're building predictive models that could help save lives, you need those insights. And so if those people are not making it through the pipeline and building and have access to build the computational skills necessary to present the data in a way that is acceptable to the level of impact that we're all trying to make, then it's just not going to happen. So I think that, like we mentioned before, it's just creating these programs and making them accessible at a hopefully younger age. We all know that by middle school, that's usually when kids either turn on or turn off from the sciences. So are we presenting them? Are they out there? Are they accessible? Are we exciting them around that? And I think that's our challenge.
And Simba, before I go to Chris on that, I'll take this opportunity to share some of the things that we're doing here at Georgia Tech exactly with that. In fact, I've got some people from my team in the room here today with us, but Chris and Stephanie on my team, who are both in here, work relentlessly in the community, where they're in schools, APS schools every day, and have a lot of poverty, that have a lot of challenges, and we're working within those schools each and every day and week to introduce those students to computer science. Also have Morgan and Abigail from the team. We've worked very hard. There are policymakers at the state, lawmakers, who have partnered with us to take Georgia Tech professors and pipe us through in a digital or Zoom way that we're going to be teaching computer science courses to some rural Georgia high school students starting in January. We are trying to take what we do here, trying to take what we know the future is, and bring it to our young pre-college folks and introduce them to really high-level stuff to create that inspiration. And we're really excited that I think that this effort has a whole lot of opportunity to grow. And I think that it's something that what we want to see is we want to see every kid in the state have the opportunity to be introduced to computer science by the time they graduate high school. Chris, what are your thoughts?
I don't have a whole lot to add. I think you both did a wonderful job in nailing that question. Maybe the only little piece to add, which is a slight pivot from the question, is when you think about credentials, how do we in the corporate world make sure that the values that we're going after, the major problems that we're trying to solve, align with the value of some of these students that are coming out of the workforce? How do we get them excited about supply chain? If you look at the different generations of consumers today, the younger consumers have a much stronger brand loyalty to those brands for which they have similar values. And so how do we, in the corporate world, make sure that we show those same values when we talk about sustainability, right? If Dematic or any of these other organizations strive for sustainability, if that's one of our 3 key strategic pillars, let's elevate that. You're gonna see more of those really strong, bright individuals who are going to be pulled towards those organizations where the values align.
Great, y'all. Last formal question. What opportunities do you see for higher education institutions to collaborate in building the workforce of the future? Doug, why don't you start us here?
Yeah, this is something that's very exciting, Bert. And Provost McLaughlin mentioned it earlier, but as we look at where the national focus is with a lot of our large funding agencies, there's a huge emphasis on collaboration between institutions and regionally, right? So if we look at that, there's a big interest in looking at the southeastern region and universities across the southeast partnering together to solve critical problems that are important to that region, but also have implications both nationally and globally. So if we look at the National Science Foundation and their engineering research centers, we've been a party of several of those here at Georgia Tech. We've led several. We're now we're a partner on one that's focused on alternative sources for fertilizers. I think I mentioned that. We just got the AI Institute from the NSF, and a big part of that, AI for manufacturing, I should say, a big part of that is collaboration, and it takes collaboration not between just academic institutions, which I think we've been working really hard to do. It also takes collaboration with communities. So there's a big part of looking at equity and diversity in the workforce and in the participation in that, but also with our industry, right? So a lot of these programs require there to be some level of industry engagement and participation. And that's going to be a key part moving forward in establishing and being competitive for these large national grants, because every region and every state is going after them. And so I think these are going to be significant values and things that Georgia and Georgia Tech and the Metro Atlanta area really have a strength in. And if we look at Atlanta and the diversity of Atlanta, if we look at the diversity of the agriculture, I just know that from the state of Georgia, it's terrific. And if we look at the established institutions that exist in our region, it's pretty impressive. And so I think we're well positioned for that. I think the universities and the industry partners in Rowen and what's happening here is going to be a critical part of the success in making us competitive for these larger programs.
Chris or Suma, do y'all have anything to add to that?
Doug is the expert there. I think the only thing I'd add is I can't emphasize the importance of the higher education cross collaboration and even across industries. When we think about innovation, there's so much innovation that comes from one industry to another, and so finding those ways to collaborate across industries within higher education space, hugely valuable.
Suma?
Yeah, I'll just say, as somebody who did not grow up here, Atlanta has my heart, and I think it's because of institutions like Georgia Tech, as you mentioned earlier, the huge grant and funding that this institution got and what they're planning to do with it, what it's earmarked for. I already know about a lot of organizations in the community, the Optimal Company, who is working, just like we mentioned before, to get better access to a lot of our STEM programming and make sure that our STEM pipeline is strong and diverse. And I think that's just something special that I have not seen in other parts of the country, is our ethnicity diversity. This region is #1 in the country for talent in tech. We're #3 for women in tech. So it's just who we are. It's the culture of community that we have. And I don't know if it's the Southern hospitality plus this high impact metro or whatever, but there is this underlying energy right now that you can't pay me to go anywhere else. I mean, everybody got a price, but you can't pay me right now because I already see what's happening here in Atlanta and around the state, to your point, of where we have the opportunity to be and be the leaders in the nation, but then region, and then like globally. I think it's here.
Yeah, Bert, I have one more thing to add. You're absolutely right. And one of the things that we have really been excited about is seeing Georgia as a leader in the Southeast, right? Atlanta is already kind of considered the capital, quote unquote, of the Southeast. We would love to see Georgia become known as that leader, both in the ag space, but also in the technology space, as well as the future workforce development component. And I mean, all of the opportunity is there. It's a matter for us and you to take advantage of it and capitalize on that and turn that into something really meaningful for our workforce and for the industry here in the state.
Great, thank y'all so much. So we've got about another couple of minutes. So I'm just gonna go down the line. Let's tie this thing up with a nice pretty bow. Chris, what does the workforce of the future look like for the supply chain industry?
Yeah, I think it's resources that are going to be heavily focused in AI and analytics, and I think they're going to be resources that are focused on sustainability, right? When we think about some of those long-term goals, removing 10% of the trucks off the road, getting to zero food waste by 2030. As an example, in the meeting last week with the Georgia Tech Supply Chain and Logistics Institute, they're working on a carbon neutral end-to-end logistics network by 2050, right? I mean, that's a staggering thing to think about. And so for us to find resources who are aligned with those values, but also have the analytics, the computing capabilities, and the business mind to solve for those is really what we're looking for from a supply chain perspective.
I think for the human health aspect, it's going to be a lot of resources that are dedicated to precision medicine and also genomics research. Again, just being able to be more inclusive, to be able to better predict outcomes for patients. And yeah, it's just a lot of computational applications, but with a heavy depth into the biomedical sciences.
So, Bert, I'm going to paint a quick picture. The workforce of the future in the ag space is going to be very different. It's going to be individuals sitting anywhere in the state that are wearing virtual reality goggles, that are operating in a processing plant, and they're guiding automated systems that are in the plant, but they're providing that intelligent worker in the loop phase, right? So you think of a distributed workforce all of a sudden rather than a localized workforce, and it changes the whole paradigm of what workforce is going to look like, right? Right now, we're working on technologies, and we demonstrated it. We did a conference in San Antonio, Texas, where somebody there was wearing the virtual reality goggles, and they operated a robot in our labs here at Georgia Tech. And you start thinking about that, and all of a sudden this notion of what is a worker changes. That notion of, could all these college students that are sitting in their dorm rooms that already have these Google or Meta or Facebook VR systems that they're playing, real-time games on, they could be earning a few bucks an hour between classes, okay? Or you start thinking about people who maybe are disabled and can't get into the facilities to do the work, but they could possibly be doing some intelligent work. So we're gonna start seeing the labor and the workforce of the future look very different. With the continuing development in autonomy, I think it's gonna change a lot of how we do, trucking in transportation. I think we've got to really think big, and we've got to think way out in the front in order to be able to prepare and develop the technologies as well as the people for what that workforce is going to look like, right? We think about agricultural historically, and I read an article, I believe it was in the Washington Post maybe a week and a half ago, and it said in the 1800s over half the population of the country was involved in agriculture. And right now, it's less than 2%. And that's because of the developments in technology, and yet we're producing more food than we ever have, and we're exporting more food to the rest of the world than we ever have, right? And so we really have to take this long perspective, but start addressing the challenges now, start thinking about what could be. Don't kill the plant in the greenhouse. There's crazy ideas that come up and you go, let's really think this through. Let's think about how do we pursue this? How do we position our industry or our group or our programs or what we're involved in to be ready for that shift or to be positioned to helping drive that transformational innovation? Sorry, that's it.
Thank you so much, Doug. Everyone, let's give a hand for our panel here today. We thank you so much for coming out and joining us, and we encourage all of you to dig in and follow Rowen in the direction that Rowen is going. Ironically, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution today, one of their headline stories is a story about Rowen. I also want to thank Rachel Miller from my office who helped plan and put this event together today. Thank you for everything that you do, Rachel, in doing this. And Mason, I can hand it back over to you. Thank you all again.
Working. All right. Thank you all to the panelists. Thank you, Bert. So that was great. It's almost like having a glimpse into the future as a part of a conversation like that. And a takeaway for me was, we have important work ahead, right? That can only be accomplished through partnerships and working together and thinking outside of our institutions, outside of our industry, outside of our communities, outside of our state, and forming those partnerships to craft a path forward. And our vision for Rowen is simple, but it's profound. And it's to create a future that we dare to imagine, right? And what does that look like? And that's how we think about workforce. That's how we think about the work ahead for Rowen. So thank you for joining us. We have our next thought leadership event that will be hosted by Emory in November with Dr. Bruner. Excited to welcome you all again there to continue to think about the future and create it together. So have a great rest of the day. Thank you.